In 1975, someone gave me some money. They pitied me. They said, you gotta do what you want to do, and here's some money. You can go away and write. And so I did. And it didn't work out. I just thought I would produce a movie. And this guy was Jim Maxwell, is a close friend and knows me well. And he said, I said, I think science fiction's going to happen. And he said, okay, he says, you know who Philip K. Dick is? I said, no. He said, well, there's a book called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And I said, okay, I'll read that. I read it. I didn't like it that much. But I thought, okay, that's commercial. Here's a through line. Bureaucratic detective chasing androids. In 78 or so, my friend Brian Kelly, he had $5,000 or something. He said, maybe you could get an option, and that might be a good commercial project that you could get behind and make some money. That's all we were talking about, was making some money.
I had been pursued for about 2 years by Brian Kelly, who was a very close friend of mine, who had this idea in mind to make a movie based upon Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. And I'd first read it and thought I wasn't very interested.
He read the book and he said, it ain't a movie. And then Brian came back to me and said, I said, he's full of shit. There's a movie there. He said, well, could you write something down to prove it? So I wrote 5 pages, what I thought could be a structure. And he took that to Michael Dealey. I didn't know Michael Dealey. And Brian came back and said, Michael Dealey says it sucks.
Then they came back with a script, which wasn't terrific, but it was interesting.
Unfortunately, the scripts that Hampton generated initially did not meet with Phil's approval, to put it mildly. He thought, again, that it had been dumbed down, that it turned into, a detective just chasing androids around.
Well, he was really protective of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, understandably so. Certain things were dear to him in that story, mostly around, what is human and what makes us human.
There was the Hampton Fancher script, which Phil was skeptical of because it did include a voiceover.
The very first draft that he did was much smaller in scale than anything that's been on the internet or anything that has been talked about. It was probably maybe a low budget, maybe a one-room kind of motion picture, and it all took place mostly in apartments, a few street scenes, and at the very end, Rachel kills herself.
This was a small movie. That's how I wanted to do it. It's rooms, strange movie, but it's, face-to-face movie. People are talking. And I had this dream of actors, like the right kind of actors, director.
Hampton saw the novel as reflecting a lot of real-world current concerns. And strangely, one of the largest motivating factors was the ecological concern that is in the original novel. And the fact that the Earth is slowly just falling apart because of these world wars and because of these biological plagues and that type of thing. And of course, those are all analogs for pollution and for overpopulation.
The intellectual aspects of the screenplay were taken from my response to the death of animal life on this planet and what that meant. That's probably the thing that saw me through it, the first draft, was I had a passion about that, and so my affection for the project was consistent.
Finally, when I was really looking for something, Brian popped back in again with another script. And the way he put it was he told me that he'd got several students interested. Because I was a friend, he'd let me have a crack at it. And I read it and I thought it was darn good.
24 hours later, it was like, can we meet? And they wanted to do it. It was a comic book, kind of a big, like a coffee table comic book I found in London called Mechanismo. It's like replicants, gyro, metallic thing. I love that book. And I showed it to Michael Dealey. I said, this is incredible. This is like visually, this is like where we should go. And this is before Ridley. And I said, I want to call it Mechanismo. And I kind of talked him into it. So it was Mechanismo. There was one script over the cover that says Mechanismo.
The title we finally settled on was Dangerous Days, which I loved because it was very much in tune with the much more romantic script that Hampton had written.
I was dead set against it, but I figured I could get a vote in later. But go ahead, and if they'll finance, we'll call it Dangerous Days for the time being. And then Michael Dealey came up with Blade Runner. I'd used it already. It's a term that I got from reading Burroughs. He had a little book It's called Blade Runner.
It was a matter now of getting into it. We tried to get Ridley from the outset, but he was at that point planning to do Dune.
As I was mixing Alien, Michael Dealey had come to see me at EMI, and I'd known Dealey from his days with EMI. And he said, I got this script, called Blade Runner, and I said, I don't really want to do another science fiction, I just finished one. So, but I'll read it. I read the script, which is Hampton, Fancher, it was called Dangerous Days. And I turned it down.
Ridley Scott was going to be the original director on Dune, and Dino De Laurentiis hired him, and their sets were being built. They were going to shoot it, and it was going to be based on the novel, and it was going to be this large-scale science fiction film.
I was attracted to Dune because it was beyond what I'd done on Alien, which was kind of hardcore, kind of horror film. And Dune would be a step very strongly, very, very strongly in the direction of Star Wars.
At this point, something rather sad happened, which is that Ridley's older brother died rather young, obviously. And Ridley was in some depression. He really had to get to work, wanted to do something. When he's working.
I think we were shooting a commercial. I remember sort of having persuaded him, saying, look, let me read it. And I think I was reading it on the train while we were traveling to the location. I said, listen, I think, because everything else was kind of not working out right, and I said, listen, I think you should give this, a second thought. I really think this is powerful and, and emotional and really interesting.
The Blade Runner idea had stuck with me. So I'd called up Dealey saying, basically, where are you with it? We're nowhere. All right, I've reread it. I think it's interesting. It'll make a basis of a very good futuristic, urban film noir.
He said, let's have a look at the material, and he did, and we were off. It was a very exciting moment, of course, because suddenly you had a talent attached to the thing. Deckard's character is not described in the script. Any actor could play it, really. It was up to the casting to tell about the character.
One of the more interesting ones that Hampton Fancher actually lobbied for was Robert Mitchum. Robert Mitchum, of course, is one of the quintessential noir actors of the 40s. So I'm sure that Hampton had that in mind when he was actually thinking about the person who would ultimately be portraying Deckard on the screen.
And Robert Mitchum at that time was still young enough, still robust enough to be Deckard. And that's who I wanted. And that's who I wrote it for. And I wrote dialogue based on my sense of Mitchum. And there was other, of course, like always, 1,000 suggestions, like Dustin Hoffman. And that was starting to actually work for a minute. But then I jumped on, whore that I am or should have been. Well, you mean we won't have a movie if we don't? And that's what they tell you. Dealey was saying, then forget it. Because I was like, oh, no way.
It seems strange now, but at the time it seems a very interesting idea to have this unlikely, not really very heroic figure in this rather sinister movie.
Of course, the thought was, but Dustin is not exactly physically your heroic cop. And although he's athletic, he's not the man. I said, but he's a great actor, and I want to go for the character. And I didn't know Dustin and how he worked in those days, but I went to New York and met him for hours and hours.
Dustin's interest was in the nature of the film. It was about whether it was a major social document, what did it do, how did it enlarge the imagination or whatever, the mind. And there's a lot of social implications attached to it at that time.
We heard that, okay, we're going to get Dustin Hoffman. This is going to be great. And as a matter of fact, if you look very closely at the storyboards, Mentor Huebner was starting to lay in images that were similar looking to Dustin Hoffman as opposed to the characters he had drawn before.
We spent months with him, months in New York and around the place. And we all got to know each other very well. But the longer we went on, the further and further we got away from the project which we had and the project which we liked. We looked at various people, and one who seemed very attractive was Harrison Ford, because he hadn't played this sort of person, really, and he'd had some very good training under some good directors.
I liked Harrison Ford, always. The conversation was the first time I saw him, and something about it. And, of course, then we saw Star Wars. And I was really impressed with Star Wars, because that's not easy to do what he did. Errol Flynn didn't do it as good as he did it, and that's hard. And that guy I knew, that guy is a super actor, super film actor.
It's the luck of the draw that I happened to fall into a couple of science fiction type films that were successful. I like the films I made that were basically science fiction. I found them interesting, but I don't have a particular appetite or taste for it, I don't think.
And you was in London, working in London, doing this new thing called Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Barbara Hershey was the one who initially suggested to Hampton Fancher that Harrison Ford was someone to consider.
Barbara calls Spielberg, says, "What's that like, that editing that film?" Spielberg says, "Huge star now." The boys, Michael, Ridley, fly to London to look at dailies.
He just looked fantastic, and we just thought he was wonderful. We were convinced. The only thing that went wrong was that when he came into the hotel lobby to talk to us afterwards, he was wearing this hat, which he always wore, this Indiana hat. And Ridley was cross because he had intended to use that hat himself.
I remember that I read a script, which I thought was interesting. At the first version that I read of it, of the film, had some issues. I had some issues with. There was a voiceover narration attached to the original script, and I said to Ridley that I played a detective who does no detecting. How about we take some of this information that's in the voiceovers and put it into scenes, and so that the audience could discover the information, discover the character through seeing him in the context of what he does, rather than being told about it. And some of that survived and some of it didn't. We spent a couple of weeks sitting around my kitchen table trying to find ways to accomplish that.
With the meetings that followed in Los Angeles, he got carried along with the enthusiasm of doing another science fiction, because he's on a really good roll now. Star Wars, Indiana Jones. So whatever it is, it's really exotic, okay? And don't forget, he's had his little taste of other things with the best. Francis Ford Coppola in The Conversation, and Francis Ford Coppola in Apocalypse Now. Teeny things, but nevertheless, he's been there. You know, he's always been in pretty good company. Here I am coming in with this kind of weird thing, if not a little confounding, because it's not straightforward, right? It's very Marlowe-esque and very dark.
Harrison has that loose, wonderful, devil-may-care smile and attitude, and he has a wonderful presence. He's a good athlete.
Harrison's naturally laconic, dry wit, and smart. So you better be ready.
When we were casting and Ridley was looking at different actors, I made him sit down in a screening room and look at Katie Tipple, Soldier of Orange, and Turkish Delight. And I said, this is Batty. I mean, you've got to realize that. And he said, absolutely. And he actually cast Rutger without ever having met him.
He came in, because he was always a weird dresser, this guy. He was a big man, and he was wearing a puce nylon jumpsuit with one piece zip up.
A Kenzo sweater that had a big fox across the shoulder with 2 red eyes. He had already cut his hair in the way he thought Batty should look, which was the short pointed blonde hair.
And he was wearing green, floral, kind of Elton John sunglasses.
I could literally see Ridley's heart stop.
This is going to be my tough guy. And
I said, Ridley, I can assure you that the guy is Batty. And of course, obviously, it was, Rutger playing a joke on Ridley, or maybe he wasn't.
Then I had a meeting with Ridley. You only have that a few times in your life. You talk about all kinds of stuff, and you're having a good lunch. And you never get to the subject. And it doesn't really matter that much. But I think at the end I said, really, so what about this Blade Runner? What does it look like? He said, well, one of the major influences for me is Bilal, which is a cartoonist in France. And I happen to know that cartoon, and I went, whoa. The talk about character was, I think it was almost in the second talk we had before I got signed on, where I explained to him, that what I thought would be interesting for the character, and basically saying, can I put in all the things that don't belong there, the things that are so amazing about people, sense of poetry, sense of humor, sense of sexuality, sense of the kid, sense of soul. And really said, I like all of them. Keep them in. We'll work with them, and we'll find a way to get them out in different scenes.
Art direction, set design, I think generally was one massive challenge. That evolution told us it had to be this much money, we had to make it on a backlot.
Michael had a saying that when Ridley takes out the pencil, it's hundreds of dollars, and when he takes out a pen, it's thousands of dollars.
Ridley was over here hunting around for people to work on this film that he'd agreed to do. I went over and had a meeting with Michael Dealey, Ridley Scott, I think Ivor Powell, and John Rogers, and got the script handed to me called Dangerous Days. Isn't it fortunate it wasn't used? And took it home and started to do sketches and started to submit work to Ridley, and then Lawrence Paul was hired. I was the first hire on the staff.
A futurist, Sid Mead, was one of the great illustrators of industrial objects, cars, electric irons, apartments, skyscrapers, cityscapes, urban development. And I looked at this, looking at them as if they were fantasy. Now, Sid was actually a great preview on where we've gone now in Tokyo. I've just been to Shanghai. In Shanghai, certainly, the way the urban development is going, Sid absolutely had it nailed. And I didn't know that at the time. I just felt he did. And I brought him in for a meeting and said, look, we got to do it this way. I'm going to be on the back lot. We've got to do the best we can. We have a limited budget. I can't make things like Stanley took at the time. I think 2001 for the time was expensive, but he'd actually made everything, include the centrifuge wheel, and it all worked. And I would never have the budget to do that. That's why the idea of retrofitting things came about. It would have to be retroed to the surface of the backlot, which had traditional buildings, upon which we would put pipes and ducts and air conditioning. And one famous architect years later stopped me, brought me to his offices, his rather superb offices in London, and said to me, we run Blade Runner about once a month, because he said, when I saw Blade Runner, the evolution of the beauty and technology suddenly became very apparent, which is where the building can wear the guts on the outside, and the guts become part of the decoration. And so that's the way we've gone with Blade Runner. So it was by necessity we actually kind of started to design it that way.
Sid Mead, although his visual influence on Blade Runner was indeed great, was only part of a larger entity called the art department. Now, every film has an art department, and this is where the designs and the blueprints and the whole overall visual concept of the films is nailed before filming starts. The person in charge of the art department is called a production designer. On Blade Runner, that was a guy named Lawrence Paul. And Larry had a lot to do with hiring the other people in the art department and coordinating all of the varying looks and synthesizing them to Ridley's specification.
This is a rather different art department situation. Ridley's in charge of the art department on this picture, and I imagine on most pictures, but this one specifically. It's not quite fair to sound as though one's diminishing the art department or the art director or whatever, but one is, inevitably, in a way, because Ridley's so on top of it, and he's micromanaging the art department, which is probably hard for art directors to take, but okay, when the credit comes up, and it's them. Those guys had to work awfully hard to do what Ridley wanted, and they had to be very efficient to do what Ridley wanted. But it was Ridley who decided what it would be.
We were evolving what the future would be with Larry Paul, who's my chosen production designer. I hadn't worked with him before. I think he thought I was absolutely crazy. But because I could draw, it would help a lot.
Ridley looked at absolutely everything that I drew, everything that I was proposing, and would say yes or no to it. We'd be in meetings, and he would be wanting me to have more and more variety, take more chances, be more like heavy metal, which is those Mobius strips where they're in a futuristic city and everything looks different, and it's a hodgepodge of everything. Sherman was doing was the storyboards, working very closely with Ridley Scott. Ridley would hand little tiny drawings we called Ridleygrams to Sherman, and Sherman would then do fairly large renderings in tone and light, and they were gorgeous. Mentor was doing the production illustrations of the sets that Larry was building.
In retrospect, I guess I seduced the process of being hired in the first place only to do the vehicles. And because I could render, I've been rendering for 20 years at the time I started in the movie business. So I knew how to reproduce the mood, lighting, the fixtures, what you saw, and I had never done an isolated object on a white sheet of paper because that's not the way things exist in the real world. They have surroundings, in situ. So once I designed Sebastian's truck, I have it sitting on the street. It's not being used. Behind it is a building with sort of this patched over screened windows with a cold cathode light inside. Off in the distance is sort of a misty, indistinct alignment of architecture, and it has a very, very dreary effect. And that's what I pursued all the way through, showing these vehicles in place.
Everybody in the art department was tickled to work on Ridley Scott's film following Alien. Alien was a gorgeous film, the best piece of art direction I think I've ever seen in my life. And we all thought, okay, we're doing this picture about replicants and the future and a flying car. And I said, whoa, we're doing Alien too. We get to walk down that same road. Everybody got turned around at a certain point and said, no, wait, we're not doing Alien 2. We're doing something completely different. And it is the future, but it's not that far in the future.
I was told that the only set that I would be designing, because the rest would be all location, would be the street. Everything else was going to be done live location.
I think, funny enough, it took somebody not to come from LA to actually do it in LA because I'm new, I haven't seen this before, and I'm going, wow, that's good, And the Bradbury's great, and we put a little cheap canopy on. I even brought the columns from the studio because they're only styrofoam. So I had a style of crunchy kind of comic strip architecture, which is nearly real. It's real. You've got to make it real. The Bradbury building, everyone in the TV series uses that, and I said, basically, shh, back off. I'm going to use it. I'll shoot it the way you hadn't seen it before.
I've never seen anything like it. I quite honestly never had seen sets built like that. It was just an amazing amount of construction that had to be done.
Jerry Parenchio and Bud Yorkin came to the Burbank hangar where we were manufacturing the cars and the furniture, and they walked in and saw this entire hangar filled with people. And I'm telling you, I could see the blood drain out of Bud Yorkin's face. He had no idea what was going on. He couldn't believe it. You're making chairs, you're making, what are you making? Go buy buy a chair, buy a table, what are you making? But it was all beautifully designed museum pieces that you can't buy.
So in those days, because I haven't got digital CGI or anything like that, the decision to do it at night makes a lot of sense. Because I was a designer, I'm up there often. I'm all over Larry, God bless him.
A very good way of telling you how Ridley was in control of the art department is that when the first walkthrough, which we did, of the finished set, when it happened, Ridley sort of all trying to look at everything else, and he said, that's very good start. Now let's get on with it.
I always remember the first day was not good because I'd gone in there and the columns looked upside down. All the columns. And I'd seen it, I'd even drawn it for him, saying like this, and I'd put the weight at the top.
He basically said, well, the only thing I'd like to do is turn the columns upside down. And I looked at him incredulously, like, what do you mean turn them upside down? And he said, just that. Put that down here. I said, okay.
And the columns are not supporting the ceiling, but they're just big bastards. I said, look, without damaging the floor, how long to cover the floor without scratching it? Turn each column over. He said, you won't be shooting until 12 o'clock.
Sure made hell for the construction crew, because they had to come in here and, there's all block and fall stuff. Turn them around, boom, like that. And then the floor, God, the amount of time they spent polishing this floor and just wax, and they could not get the really high gloss, and then they pull it out. And so each square was like 2 by 2, and they were polishing those things.
Those eyes are one of a kind. It's like Rutger's character. It's like, if you could see what I could see with my eyes, you know, that's Ridley Scott. And Ridley was very demanding. I mean, from the point of view of the lighting and the acting and the design. And I remember him saying, put more stuff on her lips. Put more stuff on her lips. Keep putting that stuff on her lips. No, 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 more. I'd heard later that Ridley wanted me to stay in my little cubicle dressing room because he didn't want me to have too much interaction with everyone. So, I mean, that could have been part of the manipulation.
Ridley, who also came from a lot of commercial background, was constantly trying to add a kind of scintillating visual stimulation to scenes. A good example would be in Terrell's office. And we're sitting there in this big set, and we're struggling with our part of it, which is the front projection out the windows. The live action guys are struggling with the weird lighting stuff, and Ridley is saying, well, I want this light to be like, whoosh, up against the wall. And we're saying, well, what's motivating that? Is it raining? Is the floor wet? And he says, no, it's just gotta happen. And so I thought, well, if that's what Ridley wants, that's what he should have. And when you look at the movie, you do have to ask, well, what's all that about? Is that something coming in the window from some atmospheric thing going on outside? You don't need to explain it. But Ridley has always had this incredible sensitivity to all kinds of ways to create visual stimulation.
After the first day of shooting, Doc Erickson came to me and said, we're now 5 days behind, which was not what I wanted to hear, but I mean, Ridley was dealing with the smoke and the mirrors and the this and that and columns and so on and so forth. In the meantime, Harrison's just sitting there waiting to act and getting pissed off because he's not being called to the set to act in the scene.
The reason I was so thrilled about having Ridley is he's got the very best eye in the business. And that comes with a price, which is the time and the effort that he has to put into it. So he'd often be sitting up in the sky on the crane doing the last book on the table position when Harrison was sort of seething and not being told what to do, and really didn't think it was necessary to tell him what to do.
Harrison always, up to this point, had been dealing with directors, for instance, like Francis Ford Coppola, working with Steven Spielberg and working with George Lucas. There was a commonality among all three of them, which was all three of them very much pulled Harrison into the creative process of building that character.
Ridley felt that Harrison was perfectly capable of doing everything he had to do and knew how to do it. And Ridley, meanwhile, was composing the picture.
There's a part of you that wants to be totally in sync with the director's ambition. And then there's a perverse part of you that says, you know what? It doesn't really matter. What matters is being there and participating truthfully in whatever the relationships and the scenes are. And it's just a movie. Let him worry about it.
We had our man in Havana, so to speak, there on the set every day and watching it, and we saw some of the rushes. Bud was more involved, but Ridley's a perfectionist, and Ridley came from the world of doing commercials from England, and he was very, very successful.
And he's very meticulous, and that's what his genius is. And I don't take anything away from him, but it starts to slow down when you start to take many, many takes of certain scenes, and we did. We started out, we were a few weeks behind, within a few weeks, so it was, I thought things could start to take off.
I remember Ridley heard that they were upset at the number of takes he's done once when they were watching dailies, and Ridley got very angry, and in retrospect, I think Ridley was sending a message back to them in his own way. He was having a tantrum and stuff, and I think he was letting them know, don't f with me.
Yeah, there'd be irritation. I do 7 takes, and why is he doing 7 takes? I know people who do 40 takes, but 7 takes in those days was not inordinate at all. I was definitely very different. That's why I've been very successful as a commercial maker. and would look at things in a different light and put things in a different way, so they hadn't seen that before. That's why you're hiring me. And I think that went on, definitely, and that's, I acknowledge that.
A lot of people don't bother to understand what is it that he's trying to do. And I think that's what happened at the time. There was a lot of nervousness, and there was a lot of competition within themselves. And I think people made a lot of it in the beginning. Everybody already anticipated before shooting, oh, he's not gonna like us. He's gonna be unhappy with us because he thinks American crews are not good. I don't think he really sat there and said, I don't think American crews are not good. He wanted everyone to be at their best.
I realized I couldn't bring in the people I'm used to because of the union. So I'm not liking the union, that's the way it goes. And so being new on the block here, I had to learn the process of I couldn't use this, couldn't use that. I didn't want, I'm used to being my own operator. There's nothing worse when you've done 2,500 commercials, and I know I've got a very good eye. In 3 seconds I can give you a setup, having walked in a room without even seeing it before. So I don't like discussion. I know exactly what I want. I want to walk in and say, do it. That's the director's job. The director's not meant to stand there and consult with half a dozen people in the room. The term director means direct, mate. Do the job.
Blade Runner, particularly to fans, is known as a movie that has some fairly egregious blunders. And one of the most visual of those would be Zora's death scene, where Joanna Cassidy as Zora is crashing through all these display case windows.
It's like another one of these gigantic oversights to put hair on someone that looked nothing like my hair. I mean, that's something that was such a big stunt, had to be planned in advance, and unfortunately it wasn't. It was basically a wig pulled out of somebody's bag, and it just never cut it.
I think one of the greatest images in the film, and Ridley came over to me and said, okay, I want you to do this now. I want you to go get some plexiglass and break it up. He took all these pieces that I had cut up and laid down that looked like shattered glass and mixed it with the glass. And there must have been about 6 or 8 C-stands around there where we hung neon on there. And what looks like a happenstance kind of thing. It took forever to set it up, but that image really sticks in my mind because it's so beautiful.
I didn't have much to do with them and didn't see much of them, I know, till we started getting behind schedule. And I know Bud Yorkin was the guy, who used to come down on the set. And in particular, I remember one night when we were shooting, which was a difficult sequence, Zora getting shot. And I remember Bud Yorkin was down there just wanting to know expletives apart, why we were going so slowly and what the hell, was going on, and pointing his finger pretty aggressively at Ridley.
As a director, I really had empathy for what he was going through, and I knew it was a huge task and so forth. I never liked the idea of producing. I only produced in my life 2 pictures that I produced and didn't direct. And that's very frustrating for anybody who's a director. Directors don't want to just produce because they're watching another director work and they could say, God, come on, move it, or change that, or why are we arguing?
I think Bud secretly wanted to direct it himself. And if he had, it would be obviously a very different movie. There was conversations like that led nowhere because we stood by Ridley and said, he's got to finish the movie. That's what we bought. That's what we're paying for.
I would never, ever deliberately ignore a budget and just say, fuck it. Let's just spend the money. I just don't function that way. It drives me crazy to go over budget. I hate that. For me to go over schedule, I hate that. And I think one of the important things is when you're shooting, particularly from my point, I'm one of those directors who always must be told where I am financially, what I've got to do, but be told early enough so I can do something about it. My job is to get what I promise I'm going to get. And that's why it was good for any investor, as they probably will have discovered by now.
I have a great rapport with stunt guys because of this, because I ride horses, I fence, I do some martial arts and that sort of stuff. And I always watch them, see how they prepare, watch what they do.
It might have been 30 feet from the floor to the top, so we had an airbag at the bottom, so if you didn't make it, and if I remember it correctly, the guy that doubled Rutger, the first jump he made, he didn't make it. He hit and bounced off and went to the airbag.
Another stunt guy comes in. He does the same thing. And now we're at 5 o'clock in the morning. We've got an hour. And I'm saying to Ridley, if you put the building and the building wears on wheels, if you give me a foot closer, I swear, it's not a problem for me. I can do this. And he's desperate by now, so he goes, okay, let's do it. And then, we did one take and I jumped.
Rutger just did one big bargy hop. He went with a dove in his hand. Because he came to me and said, I thought a simpler piece, is this okay? And I'm going, yeah, go on. The light's getting blue.
What if I take a dove with me and then when I die, I just hold on to the dove for the last bits. And then when I die, I just let it go and that's it. End of story. And then the dove can act for me. And he said, well, interesting, but let's shoot it 2 ways. That was sort of the visual part of, death. There was a real page of opera talk that, is bad in any script. I don't care how you look at it. And this was high-tech speak that had very little bearing on anything, that the movie had shown you before. So I just put a knife in it. And I did this at night, and I didn't know if Ridley was okay with it.
Like most actors, aware that, this is his death scene coming up, this is his kind of moment, and they suddenly start getting pretty tenacious about what they want to shoot and what they want to have covered. And I think he was quite demanding at that time of Ridley.
I came up with, 2 lines that I had some sort of off-worldly feel to it and some poetry in it. And then I came up with the line, at 4 o'clock in the morning, all those moments will be lost in time like tears of rain. And I brought it to the set and really liked it.
Rutger is big and bold and interesting as an actor. It was I had a great time working with him. Some of the scenes we had together are some of the most satisfying professional moments I've ever had, and I think the 2 characters depend on each other in a dramatic sense. So I was very grateful to have his capacity and his strength and his focus to work with.
I look at Blade Runner as the last analog science fiction movie made because we didn't have all the advantages that people have now. And I'm glad we didn't because there's nothing artificial about it. There's no computer-generated images in the film.
The things that pervaded us during the whole production was, how do we pull rabbits out of hats here? How do we do more for less?
I always remember them coming off going, wow. I mean, they nearly got me involved in special effects in a big way.
It was plain old-fashioned filmmaking with C-stands and gaffer's tape and running the big 65-millimeter cameras.
In retrospect, this is probably one of the last great in-camera special effects movies ever done.
In the late 70s, there was kind of a resurgence. As far as visual effects went, it was like a rebirth because there's a large void, decade and a half before that. There were effects in some films, but there wasn't enough infrastructure to do a large film, like Star Wars or Close Encounters.
The ground was changing, suddenly we had motion control cameras and suddenly computers had reared their head. But as we were doing Blade Runner, I did have personal connection with Dougie Trumbull and Richard Urasich. And I know I had a part in persuading Richard, to do the movie.
It was a very small film at the time. It was about $2 million, and it was about 50 or 56 shots.
They had based it on doing a like number of shots to Alien, which really wasn't enough for this film. And the more Ridley got into it, the grander his vision, I think, expanded.
Once they saw what could be done and some of the demonstrations of the fine work that was there, of course, it would be any kid's desire or any good director's desire to just do more of the same, to actually say, wow, if we can do this, then we can also do this.
Well, part of what really worked for Blade Runner was the fact that we were all stupid and didn't know too much, so we had to figure it all out for ourselves. Some of the choices that we made then I would never have dared make now, although they're actually good choices.
The thing that made our work in Blade Runner fit the movie was that we worked to the concept. And you never design a visual effects shot to have the audience go, oh, wow, what a neat visual effects shot. What a great design. It always has to tell the story. And fortunately, in the case of Blade Runner, one of the protagonists was the city, was the environment. People had to live in this very oppressive environment. And that is one of the key characters in the story. Mark Stetson and his crew had developed a very good system of photo etching.
Basically, you would do very intricate drawings, and then that would be applied photochemically to a piece of brass, and then they would apply acid to it, which would eat away the areas where the lines weren't. And so you get this really fine filigree detail that really, really was nice. And all those spires, you just draw kind of a side view of all those, and then you can replicate hundreds and thousands of them very, very easily with the etched brass.
I like to get in there because I like to see what the lighting was, and I pushed hard for smoke.
When you're shooting things that are only 10 feet away from you, and it has to look like it's 2 or 3 miles, the only way to build up the sense of aerial perspective at that time was to fill a miniature room full of smoke and create things blurring off and graying off into the distance.
It had to be in the camera, and that's where Doug came in and again put his brain to it, saying, I know what to do. Again, he went off and did a lash-up with fans, electric fans, smoke detectors, and we absolutely tented in the area with black drapes and then plastic, so we contained it. And then the smoke detector would sense that the smoke was dropping in the room, would trigger a puffers that would puff smoke into the room and maintain level in the room. Because if you're only doing frame-by-frame animation, which was what we were, then you're going to get flicker, because the smoke's going to vary. It's going to flutter. And there was no flutter.
I just had this scheme. I just wanted to do it as a series of silhouettes in smoke. And I wanted the smoke to really be the light and the light to light it up. Everything about that miniature had to be lights.
I think it was 20,000 fiber optic light tubes coming up into all of these points. And in the foreground, we had some towers that were about this big. And we set them in there and set little interactive lights on them, because nothing exists in space without reflection and light affected by everything else.
And that really started to bring it to life. It still looked pretty crazy to look at. But, like I said, we were stupid back then. And it worked.
That opening shot, I think, had 17 passes. So they ran it, stopped, wound it back, ran it again, wound it back.
Recently finished Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Blade Runner was the beneficiary of having all that equipment already in place, all the lenses, all the cameras, all the motion control. It had all been worked out.
We were working with tools by today's comparison that were very crude. Just to program a move sometimes would take all day long, because it was done with a system almost the same as Etch-a-Sketch. You'd sort of mark a trajectory and then mark another one and mark another one, and then run a motion test with a black and white reversal film, no such thing as a computer video at that point, and then process it and look at it and go, well, that was all wrong. What were we thinking? And go back and, and after a while it became clear to me that we had to previs in our heads.
We had learned to work that way with Doug because of his use of the smoke room and how much that obliterated detail. But it was so totally dependent on light that miniatures really became like substrates for light. And Dave Dreyer, when he came on board, had the same philosophy. He said, if there's a problem, solve it with light.
Ridley and I decided to see this film before we showed it to Tandem on our own. So we sit there, the lights go down, and we never said a word through the entire film. And when the lights came up, Ridley said, I think it's marvelous. But what the f*** does it mean? And we knew then that we had some restructuring to do and a lot of work to make this thing work. It didn't mean changing everything round. It meant getting into each of the scenes and developing them more.
Did a rough cut, and they showed it to Hampton one day, then showed it to me the next day, so we wouldn't run into each other or anything. And Hampton was kind of horrified by the picture.
I hated the assemblies. There's everything. I told you guys that you didn't have an ending. I told, I think it was with Warner Brothers, and we're in this screening room that has this amphitheater, and we go into a room, and we start talking, and I'm furious.
He said, you've ruined it. That, which made me feel really bad. When it was screening out the Valley, he had no idea what it takes to put a film together like that. And that scared me more than anything, that somebody would say that.
I think it was 4 hours long. And there was a 3-page scene I'd written that was now 14 minutes long, right? I mean, it was quite startling, but it was also magical and awesome and stunning.
Went back and started to edit through the attractive thing was editing through the English summer into the autumn.
Bud and I, and Robin French, who was one of our partners, we spent, I think, 6 weeks in England with Ridley, cutting the film and doing all the special effects and whatever else. And it was, there was a lot of tug of wars, what should stay in, what shouldn't stay in.
They would come over to see things, and the trouble is, no matter what we did, they didn't like it.
The Warner Brothers had the right to do anything from over 2 hours they could take out if they wanted to.
I wanted it to work like the thoughts of his. So he would pick up a photograph. He would then start looking at it and remembering, and you'd see this unicorn running through the forest coming towards you. It'd come right up to camera, and it would shake its head. And as it shook its head, I cut to him shaking his head, like shaking that thought away. And he just made it such a lyrical piece and magic.
I never understood the unicorn. I never understood a lot of things, but they were things that Ridley obviously was fond of and likes.
To this moment, when he comes flying through I had no idea what was it, nor did anybody in the film. I don't know now. When they run his cut, you look at that and you say, well, what does that unicorn mean?
I remember them saying, if it doesn't really mean anything, we're going to cut it out. So they were throwing away things that were there for reasons. I mean, it's all tied together at the final frames of the film when he lifts up the unicorn. The fact that they know that his thought pattern works with the unicorn is one of his memories. Another scene there where he's standing behind her in his apartment and he's out of focus, but you have this glow in the eyes which makes him, could he be a replicant? Could he be? That was trimmed down. I mean, all the subtleties were taken out. That's the terrible thing about filmmaking anyway. Most of the things that go first when they think a thing's too long are the subtleties. Do you know the terrible thing about Blade Runner was it was being made for people who didn't understand what it was about.
When we finally screened the picture in Denver, and we got the cards, a lot of the people said, they couldn't understand it. It was unintelligible. They couldn't follow this. They didn't know what the people were saying. It was kind of a different language.
Too much confusion at this point, saying, well, what's this, what's that? What city speak? I don't understand this. What's he saying? And I'm going, oh, God. And then the previews reflect that.
Bud and I insisted that we put some voiceover with Harrison to clarify some of, to move the thing forward. And I know this, Ridley never agreed to that. He never liked it. And the minute they ended up doing the director's cut, and that was the first thing he removed.
It wasn't their idea, it was our idea. It was, I am not stupid. I looked at the results and said, this ain't working. I agree with you. What can we do? How about voiceover? Okay, yeah, let's do it.
Hampton had a voiceover on it, a noir kind of voiceover on it. I did a lot of rewriting on that. They asked me to come to England where Ridley was editing it and stuff and write some more voiceover to solve some problems and stuff, which I did. And then I learned, and I can't remember exactly when I learned, that they'd asked Hampton to do it too, because as Michael Dealey said to Hampton, well, David's stuff's wonderful on the page, but when you speak it, it's, not right or something. And you have to understand, by this time, the story needed help from the voiceover. But of course, that sounds awful when you just start telling the audience what's going on.
I never believed it was going to be used. And when I started talking to Ridley about it, it turned out that they were things that he was not out of sympathy with.
And he's right. He said, this doesn't sound right. And I said, no, you're right. So we tried every which way to rewrite. Except it was difficult to write. We couldn't actually land on what he should actually talk about. It's a romanticized view of internalizing what's in his mind. What would he be thinking?
Turned out Ridley and Warner Brothers had some issues with the voiceover narration. And The final versions of the narration were done without Ridley, and I missed him.
We all went to London to do the cutting and do the post-production. And when we were away, that's where they sneaked in and did the voiceover.
I was obliged by my contract to supply that voiceover narration. And on the last one, I went in to do the voiceover narration, and I was looking around for somebody. The room was there, and the mic was set up, but there was nobody around. So I went to a nearby room, and there was a guy in a little gray hobby suit with one of those twist-together belts with the little elastic around it. And he had a little pipe, I believe, and he was hammering away at a little portable typewriter. I thought, this must be a writer. So I leaned and I said, "Hi, I'm Harrison. How you doing?" And I got this. So I went away. And about 15 minutes later, he appeared, obviously the author of what I was to read.
Tandem, Blade Runner, narration, quarter-inch roll number 3.
And I thought, this guy is so far away from the process that I mustn't fall into the trap of trying to discuss this with him. Simply do it the best you can, and go home, because I had arduously argued through other versions to try and get the best version that we could of the narration, even though I didn't think it was necessary.
I think it was Jerry's team said, you know, it's that dark ending, we need a happy ending.
Now there was a mandate that we needed something to lead the theater goers out with a much happier mood. So it was decided to show the two of them escaping from the city, driving through a lush wilderness, and essentially going into something very nice and upbeat from a world that had been anything but. They took a very small crew and a spinner on a flatbed truck up to Big Bear Lake. The spinner was on a flatbed, and they were very tightly shooting through the cockpit so that you could just see Sean Young and Harrison Ford sitting in the driver's seat, and you saw the forest of Big Bear going by as Deckard told the audience that, oh, by the way, everything we've told you over the last 2 hours isn't true. Rachel's going to live forever, and we're all going to be happy. They decided to try to get some widescreen shots of really nice-looking nature.
I was sent to shoot it with a cameraman, so it was just him and I. And we were flying around in a helicopter for 6 days. When we got back, you couldn't see anything because there was a lot of cloud and there was a lot of snow. So everything was shot was completely useless, which is why the final sequence in the opening, in the first cut of thing, was outtakes from The Shining.
Ridley, being a fan of Stanley Kubrick's, remembered the footage that opens The Shining.
If I know Stanley doesn't fly. He has never gone to Montana. So he must have done a blanket shoot of every peak in Montana for The Shining using the best helicopter crew. I'll bet he's got weeks of helicopter footage.
I got through to him, which in itself is quite something to even get Stanley's number because he's so private, even though you've worked with him. And he was very receptive. He loved Alien. He really sort of admired Ridley. And said, yeah, but, you know, as long as there's no footage used that's actually in The Shining, you know, there's a lot of outtakes, etc., and if it's any good, fine.
Within about 17 hours, I had 6 weeks of helicopter footage in trolleys, arrived in trolleys. It's a getting away shot where I had to shoot them on the road and just doing this, you know, let's get married and all that schlocky stuff. And I did it because I figured it might actually affect what I thought the outcome of the movie would be negative. I better deal with it.
I was in London when the movie was getting scored by Vangelis, so I had seen a lot of the footage, and it just made me weep, the beauty of it. It was just extraordinary. Ridley talking about his images and how he wanted this to be and what he wanted it to look like, and it all happened, and it was very sweet to see that come together.
I knew somewhere in there shouldn't be a disappointment. I knew somewhere in there had done something pretty good. It was then about, well, I've done it. I don't know what else to do. So we released it, and the rest is history.